plague, war, and changes in government. These are the topics in today's lesson as we explore late medieval Europe. Ring around the rosy. When infected rosy sores would form under the skin, slowly darkening into black and blue welts that would boil and pus. The lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin would swell to the size of plums, called buboes. Very painful. Pockets full of posy. Carrying posy flowers in your pocket would help mask the stench of rotting flesh and the death lingering in the air. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. We all die, dead from the bubonic plague. The plague, also known as the Black Death due to the effects on the skin, originated in China. As trade increased between Asia and Europe in the 14th century, new diseases and plagues were introduced to the Europeans, arriving from trade ships along their ports. The bacterial disease was carried by fleas that resided in the fur of rats, and when bitten by the flea, you would become infected. Ultimately, over 1/3 of the entire population of Europe wiped out. Imagine that. 1 out of every 3 family members dead. 1 out of every 3 friends you know dead. Some towns were hit even harder, where nearly the entire town was just wiped out. Besides the children's song, there are other ways the bubonic plague has affected our culture today. During the earliest outbreak, the plague of Emperor Justinian in 590, Pope Gregory I issued a decree to all Christians to slow the spread. He instructed Christians to say, "Bless you," whenever Christians sneezed. Flu-like symptoms were early signs of the plague. This, in a sense, was calling for God to heal the infected person. It's funny that today people still say "bless you" when someone sneezes, even though the bubonic plague has been eradicated and the person saying "bless you" might not even be a Christian believer. Though the effects on Europe were devastating, not all were negative. It helped put an end to the feudal system. The bubonic plague caused a shortage of peasant workers. Now that each surviving worker had to carry the weight of 3 workers that were now dead, they demanded higher wages from the lords. I mean, wouldn't you, at work, if suddenly you had to carry the weight of 3 workers that were now gone? Landlords, of course, couldn't afford to pay them, so the peasants all began to move off their lord's land and into the towns. Towns grew. Lords lacked the peasants to work their land and had to sell their land to the kings. Feudalism died out and the power of the king's central government grew. Kingdoms evolved into nations. Plague wasn't the only thing ravaging Europe in the 13th century. War broke out between England and France, a war that was one of the longest lasting conflicts in history. The 100 Years' War lasted from 1337 to 1453. There were a number of causes for the war, such as England and France argued over who the English Channel belonged to. England had land in northern France called Normandy, going back to when the Normans had conquered England. England also had land in southern France, bourgeois through royal marriages. When England was under the rule of the weak king, King John, the same king that was forced to sign the Magna Carta, the French suddenly seized it. However, when King Philip IV of France died without a male heir, the closest male relative of King Philip IV was King Edward III of England. What? So, the English king naturally claimed to be the rightful king of France, as well as England. Now, do you think the French would allow themselves to be ruled by the English? Heck no. But England invaded France, and thanks to the invention of the English armor-piercing longbow, they proved to be highly successful for the first few decades of the war. Such English victories include the Battle of Crécy in 1346, when English longbowmen soundly defeated French cavalry near the River Somme. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356, when Edward the Black Prince captured King John II of France, plunging France into chaos. And the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen under King Henry V defeated a far larger French force, a battle made famous in later centuries by William Shakespeare's play Henry V, where the king delivers his famous Band of Brothers speech just before the battle.
But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother.
Just when it looked like the French would lose their country, a teenage girl turned the tide of war. Her name was Joan. She believed that she was receiving messages, visions from God through St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and Michael the Archangel. And God was using the girl as a messenger to carry out his will. What was God's will? To liberate France from the English. At that point, France was without a king, and the French prince, the Dauphin, was waiting for a French victory and the support of the people to be crowned. And that is when Joan of Arc showed up. After convincing the Dauphin that she was sent by God, he gave her a suit of armor, a battle standard, and sent her off to the siege of the town of Orleans. And remarkably, she and the French army recaptured Orleans, and the French people began to view her as their savior. After more French victories, Joan of Arc stood near the Dauphin at his coronation as he became King Charles VII of France. At the siege of Compiègne in 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the English and tried as a heretic. I mean, how else can a female lead soldiers to victory unless she was a witch? I mean, that was the English clergy's way of looking at it. How often throughout history have women proved themselves on the battlefield and still men doubt their ability? It's a shame. And it's even more a shame that the church burned Joan of Arc at the stake for her supposed heresy. It wasn't until 1920 that the Catholic Church apologized for this mistake and then made her a saint. But fortunately for the French, the rest of the war went in their favor, and they slowly won back all of their land from the English. The final battle took place in 1453. The Battle of Castillon went down in history as the first European battle where cannons were used to determine the victory. The French killed 4,000 English in this battle. Now let's take a look at one final aspect of late medieval Europe. Between the 1200s and 1500s, Europe saw many changes in the style of government. In Spain, as I had taught in an earlier lesson, the country had been invaded and conquered by the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate during the early Middle Ages, making it Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. But by the 13 and 1400s, fresh waves of Moors were invading from the south and battling the Muslim kingdoms, weakening them. With Muslim fighting Muslim, the Christians in Spain took advantage of this and began to unite, and slowly but surely they began to retake their land. This was called the Reconquista. And when the king of the Christian kingdom of Castile, Ferdinand, married the queen of the Christian kingdom of Aragon, Isabella, Christian Spain became united. Together, Ferdinand and Isabella captured the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the Kingdom of Granada. Granada fell in 1492. To ensure that Spain remained Christian, Ferdinand and Isabella launched a brutal inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition used torture to convert both Muslims and Jews. Between 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed over the course of its 350 years of practice.
The Inquisition, what a show. The Inquisition, here we go. We know you're wishing that we'd go away, but the Inquisition's here and it's here to stay.
In early 13th century England, the lords were angry with King John. The king had bankrupted the country by fighting and losing a series of wars. He lost Normandy and most of England's possessions in France. So the lords rose up against their king. This led to the First Barons' War. Another word for lord is baron. The barons won and forced King John to sign a document called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was signed in 1215, and for the first time in history, it guaranteed rights to the common people and made even the king subject to the law. Individuals were allowed a trial by jury and required the king to ask the Lord's permission if he wanted to raise taxes. In 1264, when England's King Henry III disregarded the Magna Carta to place heavy financial demands on the Lords, the country plunged into the Second Barons' War. Again, the Lords won and Henry became merely a figurehead as England gravitated towards a parliamentary system. And from here on out, the kings and queens of England had to share their power with Parliament. Parliament is divided into two houses. Originally, the lords and bishops made up the House of Lords, and two representatives of each county made up the House of Commons. But today, the House of Lords is made up of hereditary lords, bishops from the Church of England, and life peers chosen for their service to their country, while the House of Commons are individuals elected by the people. The king or queen selects a prime minister to lead Parliament, who is a member of the party with the most representatives. England had just made a huge leap from total rule by a monarchy to a more democratic system of government where the power comes from the people. And this parliamentary system of government in England is going to become a model for other nations around Europe in the centuries to come and around the world. And thus concludes our exploration of late medieval Europe. It's quite a fascinating time period, wouldn't you say? I'll see you next time when we cover Europe's Renaissance. Until then.